Outubro is not in her.
This is it, Todd.
Pessoal,
El Todo, my friend. This is the crescendo. We have 2 days of warming up for your presentation.
For this moment.
For this moment.
For this moment.
I could
Pessoal,
not be happier.
Não que o Todd precise de apresentação. I don't know if you can understand me when I speak in Portuguese. Can you? So I speak in English. That's okay.
Either way, I just look at your beauty, Hugo, and I absorb it that way.
I will speak in Portuguese. If you want to understand, you can choose Portuguese in the interpretation because we have live translation. No?
That's
this
great.
Is not those events. This is not these small events that you are invited for. We have a structure here.
Perfect.
Pessoal, é com muito orgulho que a gente traz o Todd hoje aqui. O Todd, pô, eu considero o Todd um grande amigo. Comecei no Hop com ele lá em 2012, né? Já contei essa história. Ele me desafiou para ver quem comeria mais num rodízio de carne. Só que ele cresceu os olhos no buffet lá, ficou de zoião, encheu o prato de batata, tomate e tudo mais que vocês possam imaginar. Quando veio a carne, tomou um vareio meu, né? Porque eu, pô, adoro carne, então se vocês quiserem me convidar para um churrasco. Mas o Todd tem uma característica incrível que eu me identifico muito, que é o bom humor, assim, ele está sempre bem-humorado, sempre com essa cara boa aí, conta boas histórias. Eu tive a oportunidade de traduzir o primeiro livro de Nova Visão para o português, que foi o livro do Todd, Os 5 Princípios do Desempenho Humano, e acredito aí, vocês devam ler, se tiver oportunidade, busca lá no Amazon, vocês vão aprender bastante. E agradecer ao Todd por ter aceitado o convite, por estar aqui conosco, sem dúvida o mais querido. Galera, pô, gosta demais dele, como nós também. E é um prazer recebê-lo, Mr. Todd Conklin. It's all yours, your time.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction and the story of the time a little tiny mosquito ate more meat than a giant elephant. I'm using metaphor to explain that. Let me just explain to everyone that will never happen again. However, I must tell you that pan de queso, the pan de yuca, the bread, I could eat that until I explode. Let's just put that out on the record. And I cannot wait for the time.
Pão de alho, pessoal, pão de alho, churrasco de pão de alho, é isso que ele está falando.
It's the best. It's amazing. And I cannot wait for the time when I can come back and see you guys again. So I was more than pleased to be a part of this because I'm so excited and, to be really honest, pleased with what you guys are doing in Brazil around the work you're doing with safety and moving to the new view, the new understanding. And I think that's incredibly important to what we want to do. And if you don't mind, I'm going to just show my slides over my shoulder. Hugo translated these for me, I think before the buffet, but no, I think after the buffet, but before dessert is when he did this for me. So I think the slides are going to hold pretty well and allow us to have an interesting conversation about where you guys are and the journey that you're taking. So the world has changed a lot in the last 20 months, and it's kind of an interesting journey. And it's not been great, but we don't need to talk much about that. We're living through it. But I do think it gives us a place to begin our discussion. Because if we would have had this meeting 20 months ago, before the global crises and the pandemic, I'm relatively certain that all of our companies would have been very aligned towards creating operational efficiency. Better, faster, cheaper. We need to do as much as we can with as little resources as possible in order to create value for the shareholder. You remember those conversations because you sat in many meetings where those conversations were being held. What's interesting is that then comes a big dose of uncertainty. And it was a big enough dose that the entire world, todo el mundo, got to enjoy this uncertainty in some ways. And what it's done is it shifted our organizations so that conversations we've been having for years now make more sense to our companies. Remember, in the old days, the organization was aligned towards creating efficiency. But now organizations are much more sensitized and much more interested in creating resilience. And that, I think, helps our case in ways that are unimaginable. And I think the opportunity to bounce forward out of this series of crises is probably going to be rich. And I think if we're smart, we can use it to our advantage. But to do that, I want to tell you a story, because I think the stories are the best way to communicate. And I know, because of my visits to Brazil, that you're not afraid to both tell and listen to stories. And the story I want to tell is about this glove behind me. But I'm not going to tell the story yet. I just want you to kind of memorize this picture, because I think this picture will be a big part of what we talk about on my little section of your great meeting. So let me get started. And I told you already, I'm going to show slides behind my head so you can see those. Let me show you my opening slide. This will just be the test to see if we're communicating effectively, not only through the Zoom medium, but also cross-culturally from North America to the beautiful South American area that you hang out in. So here is slide number 1. Read it carefully and see what you think. Okay, if you didn't know this, this is actually a really important part of learning life. I think this is a good life lesson. So let me give you a little story about this slide. I actually don't have a story about it. That seems like that would be gross, but I can kind of give you the origin of why I picked this slide. So you heard David talk so beautifully about the work that's been in the past. And I wrote this book a bunch of years ago, and it did really well, surprisingly, called Pre-Accident Investigation. Maybe you've heard of it. And I got invited to all these meetings, and I got invited to this big safety meeting where they wanted me to keynote. And there were 8,000 safety professionals at this meeting. It was really big. And I thought, I'm going to start with this slide. This is the perfect slide to start with. So I popped it up. There's 8,000 people in the room, and it got a pretty good response. It sort of broke the ice. It's kind of funny, right? And then I'm getting ready to go on with the rest of my presentation, and I look up. This is completely true. And there's a person in the back of the room with their hand up. And I thought, man, I never imagined in a million years this slide would actually get a question. Like, if I had a question about this slide, I don't think I would ask it in public. This seems like something I would Google privately. You know what I mean? But now I'm in this dilemma where I have this person, they have a question, and I have to decide what to do, because a good presenter would probably just go right ahead and ignore the person. But if I did that, I wouldn't get to find out what they're going to ask. So I stop the meeting and I say, "Sir, do you have a question?" And the person stands up and from across 8,000 people says, "Does the order you take them in make a difference?" And I actually added this line, which I think makes this slide nearly perfect. And that's kind of our launching point for really the story we want to tell. Now, you've talked to lots of people in the last 2 days. And so you know that the story we tell of safety in the world we live in now is a story that really starts with a journey from years ago. And if I drew this line, and you've seen this many times, accidents over time, you would see that the story we tell is really a story of steady success and improvement. And in fact, one of the challenges that all of us face is not really the notion of being safe, as David so beautifully put earlier, but really the notion of becoming safer. And we're starting to move our definitions of safety from an outcome to be achieved to really more of a capacity that we manage in parallel with operations. And that really reflects the idea of complexity and it reflects the idea of sort of the global network that we all represent and the work we do. And the amazing thing to me is that it's really caused us to change the way we manage safety. And it's dramatically caused us to change the way we manage injuries. Because in the old days, it was pretty easy to manage safety. I mean, I'm not making light of it, but if you had 5 hand cuts at a plant, you pretty much knew you had a hand safety program or problem, and you would run out a hand safety program, and everybody would take hand safety training, and you'd get a lot of stickers and some posters and maybe some banners on the fence, and you would tell everybody to be more careful and try harder. And in fact, the problem would get better. But now, because we're so much better at actually creating reliable performance, our injury numbers have dramatically gone down, and they're no longer really very predictive. So that's important, because the idea that we could trend injuries and they would tell us what to do next, that idea has gone away. I would suggest that maybe it was never there, but for sure it's gone away. And you probably heard great people, Sydney and Drew and all those people, talk about the journey that happens. And the journey is really interesting because it starts with compliance. And this is a part that we all share. And that's a part that says, we've decided this is the right way to do this job. This is the best way to do this job. In fact, this way to do the job is so good that we're going to write a procedure and a rule that says you have to do this work. And when we introduced compliance into the safety vernacular, into the safety world, it did make a difference. And we saw a reduction in injuries, and we got better. But the problem with compliance, which is something that you guys are dealing with in your community, is that compliance makes a strong initial statement, but it doesn't really cause sustainable improvement. And the reason compliance doesn't cause sustainable improvement is because, generally speaking, more rules will not create more safety. I'll give that a minute. More rules will not create more safety. And so compliance starts to level out, and you see it leveling out on that line. And that's when we start to look at things like process safety, safety by design. And we started to understand human factors and how humans interface with machinery and equipment. And we started to design handrails and control rooms. And we started to actually make the world better because we designed the world better, and we standardized systems, and we created engineered reliability. And it gave us another enormous level of improvement. But even process safety, even safety by design, has limitations. One is that it's incredibly expensive to design every risk out of a process. I would also share with you that I think it's incredibly impossible to design every risk out of a process. And so if you only focus on design safety, you'll probably go broke and go crazy. That's when we sort of found ourselves on this curvy line that flattens out. Now, this line has a name, and it's one of my favorite names to say because it's a classic mathematical term that's used to describe processes. A line that goes dramatically down and levels out like that is called an asymptotic curve. Now, asymptote is just a fun word to say because in English, it sounds kind of like a naughty word, but you can say it anywhere because it's really more of an engineering word. And if you remember, and I'll bet you do, an asymptotic curve actually indicates that your current strategy has saturated your system. So let me give you an example of what an asymptote is. So you and I have a job, and our job, we work at a very big restaurant, and our job is to cook pasta. And everybody that goes to that restaurant eats pasta. And so every morning you and I come to work and we take a big pot and we fill it with water and we start that pot to boil because that pot will cook all the pasta that will be eaten that day in that restaurant. And while we're preparing that water, we're going to add some salt to that pasta water because we only get one chance to actually give pasta flavor. And so this is our one chance. And at first we pour the salt in, and the salt goes in the water and it dissolves beautifully. And the water becomes more and more salty, more and more flavorful. But after a while, if we continue to pour salt in that water, something's going to happen. And what's going to happen is at some point, the water will have accepted all the salt it can possibly accept. In fact, the salt will stop mixing with the water and start simply falling to the bottom of that big pot. That point where the salt saturates the water, that's called the asymptote. And I would suggest that globally in safety, that's where we are. We know that doing the same things harder or the same things better aren't going to actually create different outcomes. And that's when years ago, when Hugo and I were just babies, we didn't have gray hair, Hugo. We were young and innocent. That's when a group of people got together and said, what we must do is find a way to break through that asymptote. And so we started looking around, and we started talking to people like David Woods and Jens Rasmussen, tons and tons and tons of people that are really important to the world in England and in Europe and across the globe. And we learned really quickly that compliance focuses on the people, right? Because that's how compliance works. Here's the rules, obey them. And safety by design focuses on the system. What we were missing was the place where the people met the system. And you know all this because you guys have been on this journey, and it's a big part of it. And that's really where this idea of human performance took its birth. And it was interesting because it gave us a new way to look at and understand not the worker, not the system, but the relationship between the work and the system. And we stopped sort of identifying individual issues, and we started to actually identify this idea of organizational issues. And that really is kind of the quick story of how human performance became interesting to people in the safety community. And then great people started writing and researching, and people did little micro experiments like you guys do. And they learned that interface point where work meets work, that's a really important place to pay attention. But my chart isn't done. And the reason I think it's important for us to get together as much as we possibly can is because really safe organizations that are in Brazil or in the United States, organizations that are in Asia, organizations that are in Europe, organizations with really very, very impressive industrial safety numbers still have this potential. And that's the potential to have catastrophic failure, to kill people. And what human performance allowed us to do is to actually change the language around fatalities and serious failure. Because we learned something really quickly when we started looking at fatalities. And what we learned is that fatalities aren't like sprained ankles. Fatalities aren't like cut hands. In fact, what we learned is that the things that hurt people are not the same things that kill people. And then we started to look at it really deeply, and human performance allowed us to understand the complex relationship that exists between doing work and managing the work that needs to be done, between the organization and its people and its systems. And what we learned, which was quite remarkable, is that fatalities don't happen because we failed to prevent them, which would be kind of the traditional safety view. We prevent all accidents. Fatalities actually happen because we failed to control them. And that gave us a brand new approach to understanding how we can look at serious injuries and not use the pyramid. Because the pyramid told us two things, and we absolutely believed that. And we told every worker that works for us these two things were true. One is that it told us that, in fact, accidents build upon accidents. That if you have a lot of small accidents, then you're going to have medium accidents. And if you have a lot of medium accidents, you're going to have big accidents. And we somehow made a connection between frequency and severity. And that connection didn't exist. It doesn't exist. But it also told us that we have to understand actually how normal work, typical work is a word that I like to use, how typical work is done. We don't need to wait for an accident to learn where our systems are strong, and you have many strong systems, and where our systems are weak. That changed things. And what it did is it moved us from a traditional definition of safety, and you'll know this because you're living in this world. And that traditional definition of safety says the workers are the problem that needs to be controlled. And so we make safety better by making our workers be more safe. And the way we do that is we tell workers what to do, or we tell workers what not to do. And we define safety as the absence of accidents. But the new view says something much different. And if you've read Sidney Dekker or listened to him talk, you know this is a really compelling argument that's being made. Because the new view says the worker's not the problem to be controlled. The worker's actually the solution, the problem solver. We will not get better if we don't engage the worker's expertise in actually doing work and creating improvement. And so instead of telling workers what to do, or worse yet, what not to do, what we ought to do is ask workers what they need in order to be successful in a highly complex environment where many variables are happening in real time. And that forced us to redefine safety, which is exactly where you are. You've been there a long time, and you've really sort of understood this. But now the job is to translate that out to the rest of your organization, oftentimes around the globe. And what we learned is that safety is not the absence of accidents. I mean, that's a pretty easy thing to measure, but it's not a terribly meaningful metric. What safety is for us is actually the presence of controls, the presence of defenses, the presence of barriers, the presence of training, the presence of leadership. It's really the presence of the capacity for a system to actually successfully fail without harm. And what it's done for us, I mean, I don't know if you've thought about it or not, but what it's done is it's really helped move us from almost exclusively a prevention bias, where we try to prevent all bad things from happening. Remember the old adage that they used to say all the time, every accident is preventable? We know that's not true, because accidents by definition are unexpected outcomes. There's surprises, right? This new view actually helps us do something even more interesting. And this is exactly the work you're doing. Instead of preventing all bad things from happening, what we want to do is assure that good things happen. But that means we have to go right back squarely to the middle of this new definition. Safety for us is not the absence of failure, because failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is actually a very important component of effective operational reliability in any organization, any place in the world. And the pandemic has helped us understand where our systems are strong and robust, but it's also really helped us understand where our systems are brittle and very fragile. Safety for us is not the absence of a bad thing, because you'll never make a system good by taking bad things out. Safety is the presence of defenses, of controls, of barriers, of capacity. That little speech, that's the one you want to keep in your back pocket, because that's a really important conversation to have. And getting your organization to understand this means you have to attach this new knowledge to the foundation of old knowledge that the people have. It's not that we're telling them the way we did safety was wrong in the past, because that won't get us anything. What we want to tell them is that we've reached the limit of the worldview that says we control accidents and every accident is preventable. We've reached the asymptote. The water is as salty as it will get. The process is saturated. And to move to that next level, what we're going to do is actually help redefine what that level is. And we're going to move safety so that in a complex system, it becomes a capacity. But let's take it one step further, because I think we should. I can describe what it's like to work, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong. But I think if you really look at work and you really think about how typical work is done, this is kind of the definition I come up with. Your workers are as safe as they need to be. And I know that because you probably aren't hiring people who come to work and want to get hurt. And if you are hiring people that come to work and want to get hurt, you suck at hiring people, and you should get someone else to make your hiring choices for you, because you're not hiring the right people. Don't hire sociopaths. That's just a little rule I keep, and it's worked for me pretty much my entire career. But I know that most workers come to work and they want to actually not get harmed. That's a pretty safe assumption. So your workers are as safe as they need to be without being excessively safe, overly safe, in order to be productive. Now, this is really interesting, and we should talk about this because this makes a huge difference. Because what we've just built is a relatively good description of how workers adaptively are creating safety in real time by detecting and correcting operationally all the potential failure modalities that they will encounter. How was translating that, translator? Because I tried to make that sentence simple and it just kept getting more and more complicated as I said it. A good way to think about this is to ask this question. How do you feel about that slide? Because I'll tell you a little story. I'm giving a class the other day and I show this slide, and a lady on Zoom says, I find this slide offensive. And I said, really? This slide is offensive? And she said, yes. And I said, wow. So the laxative and the sleeping tablet slide didn't actually hit your offensive level? That's the one I was worried would offend you. This is the one that offended you? And she said, yes. And I said, well, why? And she said, because in my company, you can never, ever be too safe. Now, I understand why she said that. And I understand why that message seems like the right thing to say back at a safety meeting. But what I wanted to ask her was this question. When is the last time you actually touched a tool? When's the last time you actually did work? Luckily, I did not ask her that question because I think that would not have gone over very well and would have kind of made her angry. Instead, what I ask is this question, and I want you to think about this question. I ask her, how do you know you're safe enough while you're driving? So let me ask it again. How do you know you're safe enough while you're driving? And she looked at me and she said, I get to my office without having an accident. And I said, well, that is that's perfect. That's a very, very good metric. The problem is that you've answered a question that I did not ask. Because you answered the question, how do you know you're safe enough after you drive? And I would suggest it's easy to know if you're safe enough after you drive, But the question I want to know is, how do you know you're safe enough while you're driving? And she looked at me and she said, I follow the rules. I'm careful. I'm alert. I'm attentive. I leave space between me and the car in front of me. I wear my seatbelts. I have protection in my vehicle. And all those things are accurate. But I said, do any of those things assure you won't crash? And she said, no. And I said, so how do you know you're safe enough while you're driving? Because I was secretly thinking when I asked her that question many, many times, that I could easily replace the word driving with the word working. How do you know you're safe enough while you're working? And the lady said to me, I guess you don't. Now that is a very brave answer for that lady, because she was the CEO of the company. I mean, she was really powerful. I did not know that when I was having the argument, or I would have been much more polite and much nicer. But we talked about it. And she said, that actually is difficult because it's hard to know. And Eric Hollnagel, if you've not read him, he's so interesting. He talks about the idea of an efficiency versus thoroughness, production versus safety, and he calls it a trade-off. But I don't want you to think of it as a balance. I want you to think of it as the way we manage risk. And so the answer I'll give you is pretty simple. When you drive, you don't drive the trip as one task. It's actually thousands of micro tasks, of many little tasks. And what you're constantly doing is you're assessing risk and managing control. You're adaptively adjusting to the risk that you sense. And then once you sense that risk, you either raise or lower control based upon that risk. So I'm going to say something really important, and it's something I want you to think about. And that is that we in our organizations don't manage risk. I mean, we might be called risk managers. And I think any risk we can mitigate and remove, we should do so. But we don't really manage risk because risk is normal. Risk happens all the time. Risk is dynamic. It ebbs and flows. It moves in and out. Risk changes based upon conditions and weather and personnel and production pressure and time pressure and equipment availability and pandemics. We don't manage risk. What we manage is actually how we handle risk. And that, I think, fits perfectly with what I got to hear David say earlier, that the safety professional, that's us, that's you and I, that's what we do. We're not magicians that can remove risk from operations. What we are people who can facilitate the expertise that the workers represent in order to align controls with risk that's present. So if you think about it, every accident, every event has three distinct parts. There's the context. That's the zigging and zagging, the twisting and turning, the normal daily variability that exists before the consequence. That's part two. That's the bad thing that happens. That's the load that falls or the arm that breaks. And then the third thing is retrospect. Context, consequence, retrospect. Now, the question I'm going to ask you, because it's a good time to ask it, is which one of these three components of an event is least interesting to you as a safety professional? What's the least interesting part of this model? And the answer, believe it or not, is consequence. The consequence is the only part of an accident that obeys the laws of physics. It's incredibly predictive. Why do people fall down? Don't overthink this. Gravity. Why do people cut their hands? Sharp things. Managing consequence is the old definition of safety. In fact, we used to sort of determine how much work we did based upon the potential consequence that existed. But I'm going to suggest to you that you're living in a world where we no longer have the time or the patience to react to consequence, because in the consequence, the event has happened. But in the context, the event is happening. Our job is to move away from reacting to consequence to responding to context, which means we have to look at work earlier and we have to understand what normal work looks like. And that's a big part of what happens. But to get there, we've got to give up on the word cause. Cause is killing us. Machines have root cause failure, but human systems don't have a single cause. They'll never have a single cause. Workers don't cause accidents. What workers do is trigger a set of latent conditions, either brittlenesses, weaknesses, empty spots. They trigger a set of conditions that allow the failure to have consequence. And here's how I look at it. If you come to me and say, we had a worker who made a mistake and it had a significant consequence to production, I'll look at you and say, the least interesting part of what you just said was the part where you said worker made a mistake, because workers make mistakes all the time. The most interesting part of what you just said is that one worker mistake could have significant negative consequences to production. That's a system that's incredibly, incredibly fragile. And that puts us in a position where we have to think about what that means. And that introduces the pointy stick. You guys, I took this picture. That's my handiwork. I'm available for weddings or parties. If you need a photographer of sticks, I'm the person you want to hire. And you'll see that the stick has a pointy end and a blunt end. Got it? Right? Now, here's what's interesting. If we populated the stick, at the pointiest end are the workers. So the workers live near the pointy end of the stick. And behind them is probably you guys. And behind them is the company and the customers, the clientes. And then at the farthest end of the stick is the regulators. Now, if I ask you who's most likely to get injured, to get their hand cut on this little stick model, the answer would always be the workers. And what's interesting is that kind of industrial risk always moves towards the pointy end of the stick. The pointy end of the stick is that interface where risk meets work, right? But the second question, I think, is the better question, because that question, I think, goes to the larger organizational issues that we're all working with every single day. And that second question is, who has the most influence over the things that actually hurt workers? And this, my friends, is where the arrow changes direction. So risk moves towards the pointy end, but power moves towards the blunt end. Now, where's that take us? Well, I think it puts us in a position where we have to remember that the people accepting the risk don't actually have the influence to change the system very effectively. It's difficult for them. So in many ways, what we are is kind of the mouthpiece for how people get better. And to do that, we have to tackle this idea of cause. And one of the ways we can tackle this idea of cause is to really change the way we look at work. So when you're looking at a failure, a near miss, a close call, a minor accident, an operational upset, a disappointing outcome, that's the new term I'm just learning, a disappointing outcome. I really like that term. When you're looking at one of those things, my advice is get your organization early to change their thinking from who failed to what failed. In fact, what we're really doing is we're changing the organization from the why question to the how question. And what's amazing, and we all know this, is that if you want different answers, you have to ask different questions. If you want leadership to respond differently, then actually give them different data. And what we've traditionally done is we've always started with the worker and the worker behavior, And then if we needed to, worked out to the organizational system secondarily. But what I'm suggesting will help you so much on transitioning your organization is to get them to flip that. Start with the system, start with the how, start with what failed, start with the system first. And if you need to, then work towards the worker behavior. Now, the reason I tell you this is important is because this is an incredibly effective way to help an organization change. And one of the reasons it's so effective is because this actually gets you better information sooner. And one of the best ways to impress a senior leader is to give them better information sooner. In fact, kind of the best way to impress a senior leader is to get them better information sooner. But that means, my friends, we have to understand at a fundamental level across the organization that workers are the masters of complex adaptive organizations and systems and processes and practices. In fact, expertise on your company lives at every level of the organization. Every single level has expertise. And I think about this when I think about our journey that you and I are on together, and we've been on this journey a while and we're not leaving each other. We like each other too much to give up on each other. And when I asked that lady, how do you know you're safe enough while you're driving? I was secretly thinking of this slide. You know what safe looks like. You also know what danger looks like. The problem is that you're never in 100% safe, because I don't think that exists. I've not found it. And God forbid you're in 100% danger. If you ever think you're in 100% danger, call in sick. Tell them you have diarrhea. They won't make you come in, I promise. Workers don't live in 100% danger or 100% safe. They live in the gray area. They live in the place where we have to constantly interpret safety in real time. And those squiggly lines, translate that word, those squiggly lines. I would like to hear what that sounds like in Portuguese, right? Those squiggly lines are the constantly changing conditions, the normal operational variability that always exists in all the work we do. In fact, this is what an accident looks like, but this is often what the organization studies. This is how the organization writes its corrective actions. This is what the organization thinks happened. And it's easy to look at this and say the worker stepped over that red line. Except the model I showed you earlier didn't have that red line. That red line is a retrospective value. So where does this take us? Well, it takes us to the black line, blue line model. You know this model well, but we should probably do it just because I think it's worth talking about. The black line represents how we believe work happens. It's how we plan work. It's work as imagined. It's how we schedule and cost and budget. It's how we train. It's how we pick people and equipment. This is the work we're going to go out and do. This is the plan for next week. There it is, right there. If the black line is the way we imagine work happens, then what's this blue line? Well, the quick answer is this blue line is normal work. In fact, this is normal variability. And I would be remiss, I would be so ashamed if I didn't say to you that the blue line is really interesting. Variability is interesting because there are places where workers clearly underperform our process, but there are also places where workers clearly overperform our processes, and both will always coexist in real time. But let's take this away and actually add a line that drifts down. Let's have a problem with finger amputations. So your facility has had 5 finger amputations in the past 6 months. Full-blown finger amputations. Absolutely, your line is going to drift below the expected job, right? And here's what's interesting is normally this blue line is successful. But in this case, those finger amputations are going to appear on this chart as these explosions. Now, here's what we know. There's 2 explosions up there, but we didn't have 2 accidents. In fact, it's kind of basically 1 accident. So let's add one more line. And the line we're going to add is risk. right? So you heard David talk just before I spoke about the gap between the black line and the blue line. I'm going to call that normal deviation. That's normal variability. But he also talked brilliantly about the gap between the blue line and the red line. That is where margin lives. That's where control lives. That's where capacity lives. That's where safeguards and defenses live. That's where safety lives. And we know if the red line hits the blue line, that's a finger amputation. That's what happens. So we traditionally have tried to fix this space. Sorry, I got a little fast on my button there. Fix this space. Come on, baby, come back to me. This space. But I would actually suggest that space is pretty normal. The one we care about is this space. So is it worth it? Is the juice worth the squeeze? Oh yeah, this slide works in every language, and I'll never not use this slide. It's my favorite slide, right? Well, we know if we identify the problem early, look what we have a lot of. We have a lot of capacity, space for safety. If we wait for the problem to get large, look what doesn't change, which takes us right back to the story I wanted to start with. And it's a quick story, but I want to share it with you. It involves a facility that had a lot of finger amputations, 5 in 6 months. And every amputation they took seriously. And every amputation, they would bring all the workers together and say, be careful. Don't cut your finger off. Stop cutting your finger off. And this guy is a pretty good example of a finger amputation, because if this guy were to give you a high 5, the best you could get is high 4 3/4. But every time they would tell workers to be more careful, or they hired a company to come in and do hand safety training, or they bought special posters, or they bought stickers for their hard hats, or they sent everybody to training, and they did all of those things, they still continue to have finger amputations. And so at some point on this journey, after about the 6th one of the safety guys said, you know, maybe we're looking at this problem wrong. Maybe the problem isn't the worker. In fact, maybe the worker is the problem solver. Instead of asking the worker to be more careful, why don't we ask the worker what they need to actually combat finger amputations on this production line? So they brought a group of workers together, not bosses, not supervisors, not safety people, but workers. And they put them in a room and they said, help us understand the problem. There's only one rule for this meeting, and that is you cannot talk about hands in a hand safety meeting about amputation. And whoever thought to say, don't talk about hands, was very smart and very brave. And it forced those workers to actually tell the story of how the event happened. And they started to talk about the fact that the tools would catch their gloves, the glove would pull the finger in, and then the tool would actually cut the finger off. And somebody said, we should maybe try to invent some gloves with tearaway fingers. And what's amazing is when they came out of that room with this idea, the company said, we'll check into that. So they called the glove manufacturer and said, can we buy gloves with tearaway fingers? And the glove manufacturer said, we don't make gloves with tearaway fingers. And so this company, which is really big, said, well, we'll find a company that does. And then that company said, we didn't say we wouldn't make them. Please allow us the chance to make them. And they piloted this program at 2 facilities. And they immediately had a direct impact on finger amputations. Within the next 4 months, these were at every one of their facilities. And now you don't have to go far globally to find these in almost any automotive manufacturing facility. And what this does is it says even the best worker is going to get their glove caught in the nut driver. And when they do, we don't want to avoid the accident. We want to avoid the consequence. If we allow the finger to tear away, what we've given the worker is time to recover. That, my friends, is exactly what we want to talk about. That is our journey together. Safety for us is not the absence of accidents. Safety for us is the presence of capacity. Obrigado. It was fun. Now I just wish we could go and eat someplace. That is really what I want to do.
Hi, Todd. Thank you for your presentation.
Pão de alho.
It was amazing.
Muito obrigado.
Yeah, thank you. Todd, I'd like to take this
garlic bread is amazing. I'm always pro garlic bread. Don't get me wrong.
That's a traditional thing in Brazil. You can't have barbecue without this type of bread.
Amen.
Todd, just one thing. I've been texting you for a long time, and I was quite surprised. The first time I texted you, you responded straight away. It was like, wow. And along the years, like all this time, we managed to organize a catch-up for you to talk to my professor, Johan Bergström, one time last year. Then I contacted you at a time, really difficult time for me, and I really appreciate. I'd like to make this comment because there's a book which I read when the worst accident happens. And I contacted you because I had a fatal accident in my company.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked you if you could help me, and you gave me some advice on what to do, and it was amazing. It's one of those things that we don't want to experience, but we need to be prepared for that.
Right.
And I think your book provided me with the right frame to manage the situation and respond efficiently and as fast as I could. And I appreciate the work, and I couldn't recommend more your book because it's amazing. Like gives that, like just to step back and do what is necessary. So thank you.
Thank you for the kind words. And I think it's so important that we understand that when a bad thing like that happens, the very best thing we can do is actually work towards restoring the organization's ability to do high-risk work better than before. Because we're not going to punish our way out of a fatality. You'll never punish somebody back to life. It just doesn't work that way. So what we have to do is try to actually not meet pain with pain, to restore the ability to do that work. And I appreciate those kind words. You're so sweet. I got to get down there. Now I can think about its barbecue.
Well, actually, I'm in Australia, so I'm missing the barbecue as well.
Okay, so let's just put it out there. I don't think Australian barbecue even holds a candle to the food you have in Brazil. Not even, sorry, David, I don't mean to be offensive, but you guys could, in Australia, you could learn a little bit about Barbies from the Brazilian.
Definitely.
I agree.
Guys, I'd like to start the Q&A with a question start with Dave. Dave, there's a question here from Ronald. He asked whether we can do new safety, the new view with, if we can do the new view without having first a just culture. So what is your opinion about that?
I don't think you can. Absolutely not. I think a just culture and everything that comes with that of trust and open communication and relationships, if we don't have that environment, then I mean, that's at the heart of everything that we talk about in New View, how openly we talk to each other. Do we do like what Todd said, which is understand the work and ask workers what they need? I think when you look at the 5 HOP principles and you look at that, blame fixes nothing, it really does. And this is probably the biggest sticking point and struggle that organizations have to move towards New View, is to get past this idea that organizations need to have discipline and punishment to be successful. And in fact, I'd say if you're a leader in an organization and you think you need to have discipline and punishment, that means your leadership, your management strategy is managed by fear. The only way that I can get workers to support the organization's goals is to scare them to support me. And that's terrible leadership. Todd, your
and it's a really awful way to motivate adults. I mean, fear is not a very good motivator in the workplace at all. I mean, because if people are scared of stuff, they wouldn't do high risk work. Like I always think it's funny, people that work on oil platforms, that they use like deterrence of fear to get them to be safer on an oil platform. If they were scared, they wouldn't work on an oil platform. I mean, they like that. But I think, David, you bring up something that's worth us talking about, and that is that somehow the notion of accountability has been weaponized. I don't know if that will translate well, but we use accountability as a deterrent tool. We use it as a discipline weapon, and it's not. And so part of what we have to help our companies understand is that accountability for operational success is shared, and that everyone in the organization plays a role in creating that success. To do that, I think we have to help them understand that the day of seeing failure as an individual event has gone away. When a failure happens, when a fatality happens, as we were talking earlier, safety didn't fail. The company failed. The organization failed. And so we all own that. So we're collectively accountable to make that better. And one of the ways I think about it, it's easy and a little bit simplified, and I always get in trouble for this, but is that accountability discussions are the roles and responsibility discussions you have before something bad happens. An accountability discussion that happens after something bad happens is not an accountability discussion. You're now talking about blame. And so understanding the role accountability plays as a really important tool to understand roles and responsibilities is incredibly valuable, but you have to have those conversations before something bad happens.
Thank you. I think I'll just add something to this, because actually, when you talk about just culture, and especially in Brazil, you start to embrace and explore this idea, get a little bit muddy, because a little bit gray, because get confused between restorative and retributive.
Right.
And when they talk about just culture, they go straight to retributive, which is the backwards look, instead of the restorative, where we look forward, like how we can restore and improve and learn from that.
I think you're exactly right. And I would say we have a challenge in that the word just in just culture actually triggers a lot more than I think the original intent of that word in an academic sense was meant to do. It's probably not the best. I mean, I don't have like an alternative to offer, so I shouldn't be too critical. But I know that it's exactly what you said, Paolo. It's that difference between, well, people want to take it to the retributive level almost immediately because it has the word justice in it. I want justice.
So talking about it, you mentioned blame and all this stuff. I will cut my own skin as a safety professional, but something bad happens in a company, if the blame is not coming from the operations or the leaders, it's coming from us, from the safety professionals, because we don't want to admit that we failed somehow in identifying the risks. So we do this as well. So we try to point fingers to others, but most of the cases we start the investigation saying to our bosses that only if he had paid attention on this, only if. So, am I right in this? I think David and Troy can respond better than anybody else, because both are specialists in these issues. How can we address, as safety professionals, try to protect the employee that is already hurt and create capacity for the company? That's the question.
Yeah, I think I'd start with saying your organization might have a view about the processes it wants you to follow for audits and investigations, but no one's telling you how you have each of those conversations with people in your organization. So even doing an incident investigation, a safety professional can make a choice to perform that in a very open and constructive way that gets to the stories of the people involved and connects those stories with what's going on in the broader organization, and providing that summary and that narrative back to the organization. I remember one time in a short story, we had this problem on an offshore platform, Todd, where someone had tried to lift a valve and had dropped it. And what had happened was the engineering team had never sent them the right lifting equipment, and they knew that it was really important to try to get this platform back online. It was the last valve off, the LVO. And what they decided offshore was they did something as a team that they thought might work. They created a really safe space. They lifted it, quarter of an inch off the ground, and their lifting gear failed and it fell quarter of an inch. Didn't damage the valve, didn't hurt a single person, and they reported it to the shore. And management then initial response was, these people need to all be fired. They didn't follow a management of change process. They didn't stop the work. And when I went and spoke to the group and saw the amazing job they'd done to try to be successful for the organization, I then wrote that report in a way that said, we put these people offshore. We didn't give them the equipment they needed. They then tried to do their best for the company in a very safe way. And we should be thanking them for their excellent work and solving the problems, our engineering and procurement problems inside the business. So no one is telling you as a safety person how you need to perform those investigations.
I would jump right in on what David said. I think he hit it right on the head. That Hugo, the very best tool you have is to get the company to change their investigating protocol, so they really do give a what statement before they give a who statement. And the amazing thing about this is that, for the most part, you guys, safety owns the investigation protocol. I mean, you can change, even in really giant, big, complex companies, they can change their investigation protocols. And if you start with the system and then work towards the behavior, you just have a different, I mean, the story's just a different story. And that's the best way. But it's hard because we're hardwired as human beings to blame. Because you hit it, management blames, safety people blame, peers blame each other. We all want to blame because we want to sort of move that guilt someplace where they'll get swift medicine and it won't screw the rest of us up. But we'll just continue to have these conversations. It's one conversation at a time. I don't know how you'd say it in Portuguese, but in Spanish we say paso y paso.
Paso a paso.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. All right, so the next one goes to Todd. You are the master of this subject. What is the minimum structure required for a learning team in your organization?
Wow. So I would tell you that the person I would ask that question to is in a white shirt. Ask Hugo. Hugo's done a million of learning teams. To me, I think the minimum, and Hugo, jump in and answer this too. The minimum, I think, is that you need to have curious leaders who aren't involved in the team, but they're curious, right? And then you need to have expert workers. And near as I could tell, I've never been to a place where those two things don't exist. So a learning team's better if it has 3 or 4 people. It's even better if it has maybe 5 to 7. It's not good when it starts to get 10 and 12 because it just gets too hard to manage the information. But Hugo, you've done a million of these. You're kind of the master of them in all cultures, in all languages. What do you say?
Yeah, you suggested this in the book, close to maximum age. So my experience, my practical experience is that you need to have somebody that has that confronts you and confronts the whole system, you know, and somebody curious, somebody that is not afraid of anything. So I wouldn't stick in the number, but I would stick in the characteristics. You need to have somebody curious, somebody with power to question, somebody to write everything up, and somebody to challenges the whole stuff, you know. So more the number, the characteristics need to be present. Next one. So Todd, you have the fame and the ability to convince the leaders, the top leaders in the organization. And in my opinion, there is no new view implementation without the sponsorship of the leaders. You know, so every time we need to convince somebody here, we say, "Hey, let's call Todd," because sometimes in the journey, we've been in this journey for a long time here in ICL. We had sometimes people trying to back up and trying to come back to the old view. It's normal in every journal. So when we change somebody, fortunately, our boss down here in Brazil, he supports everything. And sometimes people want to come back to the old view, and he says, no, you convinced me, now I'm convinced, let's keep moving forward. So what would be the best approach for those situations where the whole company or somebody powerful in the company want to come back to compliance view and all these things that we saw in the past? Both of you, please.
So you're exactly right that the most important group that you have to spend the time really educating and helping to learn these new ideas are the senior leaders. Without their sponsorship, this won't work. Because really, are the doors closed? Is anyone listening to us? Can we speak openly? Really, the group we're asking to change the most are the senior leaders. I love the new view safety because it doesn't really ask the worker to do a lot of things differently than they've always done. We're just sort of bringing it out in the open and celebrating their adaptation and expertise. But we are asking leaders to be very different. And so the rule I use, and I've used this for years, when we first met, I still use this rule, is that I think however much time you think it takes to train your senior leadership, you should double it. So if you think it's going to take 4 hours to talk to the leadership team, make it 8. And when they say we're too busy, or that's hard for us to get that kind of access, or don't you know who I am, Hugo? I'm a busy executive. Step away because I'm heading to my jet. Tell them we think this is important and you play a vital role in creating this change. And without you, we will not succeed. I'm not asking for much, but I'd like to have 8 hours of your time. And one of the little tricks I use, Hugo, which we actually used the first time we met in Brazil, is when we do the senior leaders meet after lunch. Because then if you're doing your job well, you'll get them to stay later in the evening. It's a really good way to do it, because after about 6:30, their schedule's pretty open, so you can keep them longer. But you said it beautifully. Without their support, you will fail, and you can't get their support if you don't take the time to help them learn these ideas. And if we don't teach them to them, they will not automatically get them. I know they're busy and important, but even busy and important people want to learn.
Just to add something, actually, I see many people trying to introduce the new view and go straight to train the whole workforce, when in reality they should be, as you said, go straight to the top, go straight to the CEO, knock on his door and look, can we talk?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not against training the whole workforce. I mean, I think that's fine, especially if it's fun training and it invigorates and revitalizes. There's a lot of power to that. I'm just not sure what I've been doing this a while. I don't know what you train workers. Mostly when you show them a slide that says safety is not the absence of accidents, it's the presence of capacity. Most workers look at you and say, duh, we've been telling you this for 20 years. It's the leadership that really, they're the ones we're asking to be different. And they're fine being different mostly. I mean, sometimes they push back and fight a little, but we need to help them understand what that different looks like. And so we have to translate, just as we're doing this meeting, we have to translate what this new view means to them as leaders. And how, I mean, there's some big changes if you think about it, you guys. One of the things we're saying is that, for instance, not knowing the answer is a better position for a senior leader to be in than knowing the answer. Because if they know the answer, they're just going to go into the field and reaffirm that they're right. But if they don't really know why bulldozers keep falling into the water and people drown, then you've got the best senior leadership team in the world, because they're willing to listen and learn. And if you can get them to be curious, and if they understand that the power they have is in the question, not in the answer, then things get better quickly.
And I think also in that, Todd, I think where I see people being successful and not successful with this is need to put yourself in the shoes of senior leaders as well. And it's important to help if you're making them anxious or worried about their own reputation. I mean, they have boards. And so I think if we talk to them about a new view in the way that that they think means that everything else that they've got that they rely on is now not going to be there for them to convince their stakeholders that they're doing a good job, then it's very hard for you to get support. So being mindful of what they need and making sure that you still deliver what they need is a way to make sure that you'll get the support that you need.
Yes, pretty much most of the time we treat senior leaders as they didn't know something or they didn't care, but most of the time they wasn't exposed to it.
Yeah.
They
Right.
didn't know. It's
I mean,
not that they don't care, they just don't know.
I know.
That
I
is-
know
that's
some
perfect.
I know
We
some-
tend to treat them as like those guys are not no, they don't care, they are not intelligent enough. They are the bosses, you know, they are there for a reason. So maybe look at the mirror.
And I know
Exactly.
some organizations that almost run two separate safety programs. They collect all of the incident reports and all of those things so that the senior executives can present those to boards and regulators, but they don't share any of that information inside their company. And the way that they run their safety and talk to their people is completely different. But you still got to help the leaders keep the organization safe.
And one of the best ways to do it, Hugo, is to keep translating these books. You are amazing. Seriously, you have, when do you sleep? Do you sleep at night or do you just not sleep?
I asked the same question.
Yeah, it's a good question.
That's why my hair is white, you know, it's gray.
Yeah, but at least you
Lack
have
of
hair.
sleep.
Hugo, you have hair. Half of the panel is not as hair fortunate as the other half of the panel is. Let's just put that out there.
There is another question here, Todd. Simple but beautiful. Do you think that the new view or the human organizational performance is the natural sequence, the natural evolution of the traditional safety?
I do. I think it's a logical next step because it combines all the knowledge we've gathered about individual worker behavioral-based safety, at-risk behavior. I mean, we could make a list a mile long of all that stuff. And it's really helped us combine our understanding of human factors and system safety and process safety, which at ICL, you guys have a rich history in understanding process safety. And what it says is the place where those two systems meet, that's where the workers are. And we count on workers to complete the design of both of those things, of the personnel side and the system side. And so it seems like a naturally occurring next step. And I know a secret. And the secret I know is that once you move to that next step, it's almost impossible to go back to the old way. Because once you see, David's story is a beautiful one, where you see smart workers trying to lift a 1/4 inch and it fails, you start to realize that's not an accident. That's a micro experiment in a safe way with graceful extensibility. That's exactly what we want workers to do. That keeps people from dying. That's powerful.
Perfect.
I think I would like just to add something because, Todd, you keep saying one thing that is really embedded in my mind, and like you shouldn't expect things like when you go to see people, like we learn about the new view, we tend to get a little bit frustrated with the situation and where the company is. So we should be cautious about meeting the people or the company where they are and
Right.
see that as not as a challenge, but as an opportunity to bring them along. So I think like that's a different way of seeing the situation. Otherwise, you get frustrated, like, oh, this company is not for me. Well, perhaps the company is just waiting for somebody to trigger that conversation.
Yep, that's what a beautiful thing you just said. And it's hard for me to remember, but we always have to go back to the first principles. So you're always going to have to talk about human error, even though you guys haven't, I mean, you don't really think about human error as causal anymore. You don't think about, I mean, you've been thinking about these new ideas so long that your advanced thinking is in a different place than the leadership team you're working with. You have to start at the beginning. And you have to take them through blame. You have to take them through mistakes. You have to take them through sort of this idea of failing safely. All those baby ideas that we started with, and all of us started there, we need to remember that they still have to have the benefit of having that time and that experience with those baby ideas as well. One of the big mistakes that people make is they start at a really advanced level with new view safety. I mean, they're starting with like a just culture model. Well, that's fine, I guess, but you're missing all the stuff that leads up to the reason why you're talking about just culture in the first place. You can't start eating in the middle. You have to start at the beginning. You have to, whether it kills you or not, Hugo, you have to start with the salad and the potatoes. It cleanses the palate.
Have you seen a lion eating salad?
No, and I think I never will.
I think there is one question I just seen that I think is a nice place to finish, is that you know, it says that a regulator or a company, how do you implement the new view when regulators and the companies want the documentation and the bureaucracy? And I think that's a good place to finish, because nothing in the new view says you don't have any documentation and you don't have any guidance or direction for people to perform high risk work. You can have a lot of documents in your business and be running a very new view approach to safety. Don't write a document unless the workers are involved in writing that document and they love it and it matches the work they do, and it's got the space in amongst the requirements for them to get their work done and use their expertise. So you can still have all of those things. New view doesn't say to not have those. New view gives you a direction on what to do with those things that you have. I don't know, Todd, if you think of that, but I think sometimes, yeah, people don't get started because they think I have to delete all of those things.
Yeah, it's a beautiful comment. Thanks, you guys, for this time. This was really fun. I can't wait to see you guys again.
Thanks, Todd. Did you get the ForgeWorks box of caramel Tim Tams?
No, I was gonna actually. It's so funny. I was actually gonna bring some in and put them around me, but then I thought I better not, because then I'll eat them. So, but yes, I did, and I love it. They're actually in a position of pride in my kitchen, and I'm only allowing one package to be opened every week.
Okay. Well, this is like your Netflix subscription now. There'll be a box that just turns up until you cancel.
Obrigado, everyone. Thank you so much for hanging out with me.
Okay. Pessoal, nós vamos... Obrigado, Todd. Encerrar aqui daqui a pouco. Só ver se tem mais alguma coisa aqui. Agradecer muito o Todd. Agradecer a presença de todos vocês, os patrocinadores mais uma vez, ICL, Cargill, BI e a Mana Gold. Queria falar uma coisinha para vocês aqui, que a gente sempre acreditou que esse evento pudesse ser possível, né? E aí, pô, ficou bem difícil, depois melhorou, e depois ficou bem difícil de novo, mas acabou que saiu. A gente trouxe aí os melhores do mundo. Só ficou faltando o Eric, como eu já disse, mas eu queria deixar um recado para vocês aqui, que eu falo isso sempre pro meu chefe, né? Às vezes o que diferencia os brasileiros dos estrangeiros, né? Às vezes é só o CEP, né? A gente nasceu num lugar que não favorece a nossa língua, mas cada um de vocês tem muita capacidade, nenhum de vocês deixa nada a desejar. Às vezes a gente tem a tendência de valorizar demais, não que eles não mereçam, eles merecem bastante, eles contribuíram, eles têm várias contribuições relevantes, mas a gente também pode fazer, vocês podem fazer diferença, vocês podem se dedicar, tem muita gente boa aqui no Brasil, né? E que, pô, aprendendo com eles, a gente pode levar isso mais longe, a gente pode fazer um pouquinho mais cada um, e não se deixem levar por essa história de que, eu não falo inglês, aprende, eu também não falava, né? Eu não tenho dinheiro para comprar um livro, entra no grupo lá que a gente consegue se ajudar. Isso não é para mim, né? Então não tem isso, é só, na verdade, é o que a gente acha que é natural A gente acha que alguém é mais capaz ou qualquer coisa assim, na verdade é social, né? Alguém criou essa regra e você tem a opção de seguir ou não. Eu decidi não seguir, decidi fazer as coisas do jeito que eu acredito, me juntar aos melhores, e é o que a gente fez hoje e ontem, né? E se juntando aos melhores, vocês vão crescer. E não deixe ninguém falar que vocês não podem fazer o que quer que seja, porque é só vocês se dedicarem. Como eles falaram, eu durmo pouco, mas assim, eu sou muito feliz com as coisas que têm acontecido aqui, com a ajuda de cada um deles. E as coisas estão acontecendo da melhor maneira. A gente vai tornar a segurança melhor, ao ponto da gente fazer eventos desse tamanho aqui, né? Que era impensável e a gente acabou de concluir. Beleza? Obrigado.